With Hashem's loving grace, welcome to Emuna News with your host, Laser Brody. Today is Tuesday evening, May 14th, 2024, and the 7th of ER 5784. We ask ourselves the most critical question on our security agenda. Why is the Gaza War so prolonged and bogged down? And why are there still over 100,000 residents on our northern and southern borders that can't go home? They're still in a state of exile. And even more, as we look through the news with the eyes of Emuna, what does all this have to do with the period of the Omer, when Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students died of a plague? This is a period of curtailed happiness where we can't make weddings, we can't listen to music. We have to ask ourselves, what's the connection between this and the current Gaza War? Well, there are those who claim, and seemingly rightfully so, that the Gaza War would have been over in 8 weeks. And were it not for the interference of the Biden administration, who forced Israel to enable the so-called humanitarian aid that enabled Hamas to recover from a near knockout. Well, this might sound logical, but it contradicts the truth of Emuna. Emuna tells us that everything is from Hashem, and that includes the Biden administration and Hamas. They're all from Hashem. Now, to understand why Israel is far from decisive victory, and there's no end in sight, both against Hamas in Gaza and against the Hezbollah up north in Lebanon, we have to examine 3 chapters in the book of Samuel 1. This will give us the background to understand what's happening, because the Torah is the blueprint of all events in the world. Like King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. So if we open up the book of Samuel 1 to chapters 21 and chapter 22, we find that David was constantly being chased by King Saul, who's jealous of him, wants to kill him. David takes refuge in the Golan town of Nob. Nob is where the Holy Tabernacle was for 13 years after the tabernacle in Shiloh was destroyed. And Nob was a town of Kohanim, or priests. And at the time David was hiding there, the wicked Doeg the Edomite, who was one of Saul's generals, he happened to be there. He happened to be in the village. Well, he informed Saul that Nob and the high priest, Ahimelech and the other high priests and the other priests of Nob that were hiding King David. So King Saul summoned Ahimelech, the high priest, the father of Abiathar, who later became the high priest. He summoned Ahimelech and the other priests, and he executed every single one of them. Well, meanwhile, Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, he fled and he found David. He took refuge with David. And David himself is a refugee, is fleeing. David is on the flee from Saul. So if we look, that's chapters 21, 22. Chapter 23, David, together with Abiathar and David's men, they go to the town of Keilah. Keilah is on the Judean border. It's a Jewish town. And Keilah, at the time they get there, is being besieged by Philistine marauders. And the Philistine marauders, they're taking the grain, they're taking the cattle. David asks, he asked the priest. Abiathar is now with his father, and with his father killed, he's now the high priest. He asked him to ask Hashem, should I attack the Philistines in Keilah? And Hashem says, definitely so. So David and his men, they went to Keilah. It's chapter 23 of Samuel 1. And they defeat the Philistines, and they bring back all the spoils to the people of Keilah. Now, how do the people of Keilah say thank you to David? They inform King Saul that David is there. Rather than saying thank you, they inform him, and they inform King Saul. So once again, David again has to flee, and this time he flees to the land of Judea, which is his tribal land, his family's tribal land. And David was a Judean from the tribe of Judah, and he comes to the town of Ziph, and he thinks that at least here I'm going to be safe. Well, David was wrong, because while David was taking refuge in Ziph, they too reveal that David is hiding there. So David had to leave, and he fled to the Judean desert to En Gedi. Well, meanwhile, Hashem preoccupied Saul and his army with battle and somewhere else with the Philistines, and they stopped chasing David for the time being. So we see in these 3 chapters of the book of Samuel 1 that Lashon Hara, evil tongue, gossip, slander, and intramural hate, they were rampant in King David's time. So even though King David won his wars, his army suffered huge casualties. They suffered such bad casualties that a soldier in King David's time, before he went into battle, he had to give his wife a writ of divorce, what we call a get. And that way, if he got killed or if he was missing in action, she could remarry and she wouldn't be what's called an aguna, where she would be, if they don't know where her husband is, they can't let her remarry. And then she would be a widow, she would be a Emuna. So the high chances were so high that they would get hurt in battle. Now, let's contrast David's generation. That was a generation, the Gemara tells us it was a holy generation academically, that every single child from Dan in the north to Eilat in the south knew the Torah 49 times backwards and forwards, yet they would go to the war and they'd get injured, they'd get killed. And what's going on? Then we fast forward to the seventh king of Israel. This is after Israel and Judah had a civil war. They became separate kingdoms. The seventh king of Israel was Ahab. Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel. They were the worst generation in Jewish history and Israel's history of idolaters. But it's just something strange. Ahab won every single one of his wars, and he had no casualties. Well, how's this going on? But we can get the explanation in the book of Kings 1, chapters 17 and 18. There was a terrible famine. Elijah the prophet, he declared a famine because Ahab was such an idolater. And he says, if you think your idolaters could give you rain, you think your idols will give you rain, go ahead. But Hashem's not going to give you rain. So it was 3 years drought. So what did Jezebel do? She ordered her armies to kill all the prophets of Hashem. They were bothering her. They were getting in her way of doing idolatry. So she killed what she thought was all the prophets of Hashem. Meanwhile, her servant, Ovadia was a servant in the king's court. Ovadia was a righteous convert from Edom, Edomite convert, and he himself was a hidden prophet. That's the book of Ovadia. We have his prophecy. Hashem gave him the privilege to give the prophecy of what's going to happen at the end of the days with Edom. That's right now. So Ovadia secretly knew about 100 prophets, 100 holy prophets of Hashem, and he hid them in 2 separate caves, 50 prophets in each cave. Now we're talking about a generation of famine in the land of Israel. 3 years, there's no crops, there's no rain, and yet Ovadia sustained them. Every day he would bring them bread and water. Now imagine how much bread and water to keep a sustenance ration for 100 people. He's got a donkeys full of jugs of water. Everybody knew about it. Now, if anyone in the kingdom of Israel would have informed Jezebel that there's still prophets alive, or that Ovadia, her own servant, was hiding these prophets, she would have given them half the kingdom. She would have given them millions. Not a single person of these idolaters in the kingdom of Israel, not a single person tattletaled, not a single person informed. So we see, even though they were idolaters, they had clean tongues. They didn't slander, and they were in unity with one another, and they won all their wars, and they had no casualties. So this tells us, both the Midrash and the Gemara, the Yerushalmi Gemara, tells us that because of unity, we win all our wars. And the Gemara gives example of Ahab's generation. And even if a nation of Torah scholars, but yet there's intramural hate and there's slander and there's gossip, the wars get bogged down, just like what's going on in Gaza today. We see, well, why we've been in the north of Gaza. The army declared 4 months ago, the army declared in January that the center of Gaza was captured, the north of Gaza was captured. And here yesterday, right south of where I live in Ashkelon, there's more rockets. They said, rockets? After 7 months of massive bombing, what's going on here? This is the explanation. At the beginning, there was unity. That October 7th, the massacre of October 7th brought us together. So we have to take a look at what brought on the war spiritually. What brought on the war wasn't Hamas, it was Hashem. Why did Hashem do that? October 6th and before, in Israel, there was unprecedented hate amongst different groups. Religious, non-religious, right, left, pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi, everyone was everyone's next. If you hear the news would be nothing but slander. The Chafetz Chaim could not listen to 1 second of the news in Israel with all the slander. And Hashem had to stop this because it was on the verge of a civil war. It was actually on the verge of civil war where people were being attacked in the streets by people of the opposing camp. And are being ridiculed, being spit on, being accosted on buses. It was terrible. It was very terrible. So what happened? We had this terrible massacre on Shabbat Simchat Torah, October the 7th. But by that, Hashem stopped the intramural hate because we had to come together to bounce back from this unprecedented massacre. There was nothing like that since the Holocaust, where so many Jews, one day, over 1,200 Jews were massacred, and girls were raped. Kind of unspeakable tragedies, unspeakable things that we didn't even hear from the Nazis in World War II. Okay, so once again, what caused all this? Now, in the period of the Omer, what caused the Omer? Why can we not listen to music on the Omer? Why can we not make weddings on the Omer? Why can we not buy new clothes and make the blessing of Shechionu that we make over new clothes in the Omer? In the period of the Omer, 24,000 students of Rebbe Akiva, 24,000 students, they all died of a terrible plague. Why did they die of a terrible plague? The Gemara says they didn't properly respect one another, didn't honor one another. They spoke badly to one another. They were not talking about hate. They didn't properly honor. This is what Hashem demands from us, as we see in the recent week's Torah portions, that we're expected to be a holy people. We're expected to have holy tongues. We're supposed to use our mouths for Torah learning, for prayer, to make another person feel good, to encourage people, to bring them close to Hashem. But to use our tongues as weapons to attack other people, attack our fellow Jews, there's no way. So they all died of a plague. And look what Hashem did. Hashem replaced Rebbe Akiva's 24,000 students with 7 wonderful students. 7 wonderful students who became the pillars of the Mishnah and the Gemara, are sages from all times. One of those sages was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rashbi, who's buried in Meron, who died on Lag BaOmer. And on his yard site, Lag BaOmer, all the 24,000 stopped dying. So every year, we have a celebration of Lag BaOmer in Meron. But now pay attention to what's happening. This is the first year, because of the Hezbollah bombing, the first year ever that we cannot go to Meron. Meron is closed military territory. Now, what's Hashem telling us? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai tells us the Gemara Tractate Shabbat. He loved every single Jew. He didn't speak bad about anyone. And loved all the fellow. These are Rebbe Akiva's new students. Instead of the 24,000 at Emuna, he had 7 that loved each other. Rebbe Meir Balamez and Rebbe Bar Ilai and Rebbe Yossi, the famous students, Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov. They loved one another. But here, Rashbi, Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai, who symbolizes Lag BaOmer and symbolizes our intramural love, and we all go to his grave on Lag BaOmer. We can't go there this year. What's Hashem telling us? Hashem's telling us that now we look back in the media, look at Israel's mainstream media, it is back to the pre-October 7th intramural hate, and they're giving as much coverage to hate as they are to the real news, and it's the gospel. We can't stand it. Hashem can't stand it, and so Hashem has to do something drastic to bring us together. So what happened? The areas in Gaza, they were supposed to be conquered already. They were supposed to be won. No, not anymore. Have to go back to the drawing board. So we see that because of the continuation of slander and intramural hate, this is the war, why the war continues. It's not because of the Americans, it's not because of Biden, and not because of Blinken, and not because of Lloyd Austin, and not because of the UN. This is the reason, because we look at through spiritual eyes. So what happens? Hashem wants us to get rid of the intramural hate. Now, if Emuna were the law of the land, Israel's mainstream media and the journalists that are guilty of spreading hate and spreading slander, they would all be incarcerated. They wouldn't allow to be to write. They wouldn't allow to broadcast. So this is our existential danger. Not Hamas, not Hezbollah. Hamas and Hezbollah, they're sticks, they're rods in the hand of Hashem to slap us over the knuckles when we're not acting properly. But if we uproot the intramural hate, you'll see that Hamas and Hezbollah and all our enemies will fall by the wayside. And so we have to learn to love one another. And if we can't love one another, at least to guard our tongues, that not a single word of slander by another human comes out of it. And that way, we'll not only see victory over enemies, we'll see Mashiach and our rebuilt holy temple speedily in our days. God bless.